Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 17th, 2003, Arnold Schwarzenegger, former Hollywood film star and professional bodybuilder, is sworn in as California's 38th governor. Schwarzenegger had won a special recall election a few weeks earlier. The majority of Californians had voted to oust Democratic Governor Gray Davis. So Gray Davis was out, and Schwarzenegger received the most votes of the many candidates looking to replace him. He got about 49% of those votes, so he was now governor. And 3 years later, he would win a regularly scheduled election and continue as governor of California. So here to discuss how Schwarzenegger found himself the leader of the world's 5th largest economy is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody. I'm so excited about this.
Yeah, it is interesting to read about this one. And weirdly, it doesn't feel like it's just something people talk about too much. But here we have a celebrity with no political experience who decides to run for Republican office, enters during a contentious time, and there's a fractured election process. I mean, there's a big red sign flashing over me that says, easy parallels alert or facile comparison alert, which I guess we can get to and talk about the Trump and Schwarzenegger thing. But do you want to start a little bit more with how he got into office?
I do, because it was a really interesting time in California. Gray Davis was governor at a time when California was going through a series of crises. And one of the big crises was what was happening with their electrical grid, that they had soaring energy prices, that electricity was getting a little spottier, and people were really frustrated. And that, along with some other things, led them to say, we're done with this governor. We want a new one. And even though they had tried many times in the past to recall governors, this was the first time that they actually got all the signatures they needed to force an election.
Yeah, and I guess we should explain as simply as we can, if possible, the recall process in California. I will say 7 out of the 8 previous governors had faced some sort of recall effort because there is a law on the books in California that if you get a certain number of signatures, and I believe it is 12% of the number of votes cast in the previous election, then you could basically call, it's sort of like a snap election, which is a thing they have in the UK, but you can basically call an election midterm to recall a governor. So in 2003, that was 897,000 signatures, which is daunting, but obviously not overwhelming. And there were millions of dollars put into this effort to get that many signatures. And all of a sudden, here comes an election.
Yeah, and they get way more than that, too. They certified 1.3 million signatures. So this is a process that goes back to the progressive era of the early 20th century. This idea that they wanted to make America more small d democratic. They wanted to give more power to people. And this is the era in which you get things like initiatives and referenda, the ability of people to propose legislation, to vote on legislation as kind of simple majorities. And then this idea of recall, the idea that people can sort of, call a mulligan on an election and try it again. It's notable that it hadn't ever succeeded before. You can imagine this being just like a regular partisan tool where they're constantly trying to recall governors. But this time there was enough bipartisan support for getting rid of Governor Davis that it worked.
Yeah, and I'm a little out over my skis here. I'm not an expert in California politics, but certainly all these propositions that are often like weirdly worded and have like tons of money flying into them, and then these recall elections, they show, I think, some of the perils of even the best intended efforts towards raw populism, especially, again, I think the way that money can come flooding in. And so something that is designed to be, the will of the people, what the majority want, all of a sudden actually becomes something that's really you saw this last year with some of these propositions around like Uber and Lyft and so forth. And it just became like a money suck. Not that regular elections aren't as well. But yeah, it is a nice little lesson in how populism can get messy.
Well, it can be really pernicious, right? So one of the things that Davis was actually in trouble for was Proposition 187 and his attempts to stop it from being enacted. And this was the anti-undocumented immigrant proposition that was passed in the 1990s. Of course, people are probably really familiar with Proposition 8, which took away the right of marriage equality from same-sex couples. So we talk about it as a progressive reform, but it can, of course, be used in any way.
Yeah. One more little thing about how it actually works. So when you get a ballot for a recall election, there's two questions. And the first question is, yes or no, should we recall the existing governor? And if a majority of people vote yes, then it goes to the second question, or, then the second question kicks in, and it is, who of these lists of candidates do you want to become the new governor? Now, the interesting thing here is that even if you vote no, I don't want to recall the governor, you can still pick a favorite in case the majority does want to go to that. So it's a little hard to parse the numbers here, but 55% of people voted yes to recall Gray Davis. So, not an overwhelming number. And then 49% voted to get Schwarzenegger in. So he had, the math isn't super simple, but he didn't exactly have like a massive amount of Californians voting him into office. Though, again, he did win election through a regular election a few years later.
Yeah, and he won that election pretty handily,
yes.
This first recall election. Keep in mind, there were 135 names on that ballot. Because the cost of entry was so low, I think you had to pay like $3,500 and get, I don't even think it was 100 signatures. It was a tiny number of signatures. So you have people like Larry Flint, who is the guy who runs Hustler magazine. You had porn actors. You had Gary Coleman. All of these people who were running for governor, Ariana Huffington, and Schwarzenegger very quickly, in part because of name recognition, just rockets to the top of that. So the idea that he got, I think it was 48.6% in a field of 135 people is pretty impressive.
Yeah. So the campaign itself, obviously his celebrity status helps a bunch. It is, when you read back and look at this, it is a reminder, and again, it reminds me of what happened in 2015 into 2016, that like the media, even political journalism, it will fall over for a celebrity. It knows how to react to a name and a figure that it is familiar with. And so you just kind of see like he's all of a sudden, he just is in the ecosystem immediately. And it seems like it is entirely based on his celebrity status.
He announces his run on The Tonight Show, which is fascinating. There's an audience of just millions upon millions of people. And the thing is, it's not like he was an actor who had never thought about politics before. In a lot of ways, like the other actor who was governor of California, Ronald Reagan, he was somebody who really did have strong political opinions. Now, unlike Reagan, he wasn't really a conservative. He was one of the last few moderate Republicans still in existence. So he was an interesting fit for California. But I think as he got that media attention, people were able to see that, he actually has some ideas that he's going to run on.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. But one other tidbit that we flagged from the race itself, this really fascinating thing that his advisors actually went and asked television networks not to air any of his films during the election campaign because they were worried that then other candidates could ask for equal time and demand similar amounts of free airtime. And I don't think Donald Trump's folks ever said, stop airing The Apprentice, right?
Or stop airing, what was it, Home Alone 2?
Yeah, exactly. Although maybe, was there a moment where someone tried to make the equal time argument about the 3 minutes in Home Alone 2 that Donald Trump appears in?
I'm almost certain they would have. But, in Schwarzenegger's case, because the equal time rule says that you have to offer the time at the same rate. So with movies, right, people aren't paying for that time. So they would have had to give away like 2 hours of free television time. You can understand why his advisors were a little wary of that.
Yeah. So we should also mention that in October of that year, the LA Times published an article with 6 women alleging that Schwarzenegger had touched them in a sexual manner. I think these kinds of allegations have existed with Schwarzenegger throughout the years. So, again, another parallel there.
Yeah, it was so interesting rereading this because, of course, this is happening 15 years before the Me Too movement really becomes a national phenomenon. And you could imagine this playing out very differently if he were running in 2018 versus 2003.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I know the last few things I've said have all fallen into the trap that I said that I would not fall into of these easy comparisons. So now let's point out some of the ways in which, I think Schwarzenegger is very different from Donald Trump, which is, as you said, he had a political evolution, and I think he did two, to my mind, simple things, but, things that apparently not everyone is going to do, which is he actually took the job very seriously and he surrounded himself with real political operatives and people who would really help him manage the state.
And he was a reform-minded governor. He came in promising things like ending gerrymandering, curbing campaign contributions, things like that. He didn't get those things, but he did create open primaries. He made sure that district lines would be drawn by an impartial panel rather than the very partisan legislatures that normally draw these redistricting maps. So I think that there was something appealing about him in that sense, too. Remember, it's coming off of the 1990s and the reform movement that Ross Perot represented. People wanted, real systemic reforms, and he was able to offer some of those.
Yeah. And it is interesting, though, that he didn't totally shed the I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger side. And I guess Reagan sort of struck this balance, too. He knew when he could just remind people that he was a very charismatic person that they'd seen on TV before. But Schwarzenegger, even during budget addresses, would still refer to his opponents as girly men or use catchphrases. I don't know did he refer to himself as the Governator? I mean, it's this interesting balance that he was able to, I think, be relatively serious-minded and relatively effective given the context, but also still just be a celebrity.
Yeah, I think he balanced it pretty well. I mean, he didn't seem to be play acting his way through the governorship, but of course, what did most Americans know him as? They knew him as the Terminator. They knew him from all of these other roles that he'd had. And so it would have seemed, I think, inauthentic for him to never reference that body of work that made him a star in America.
We should say that in 2018, Schwarzenegger did express regret for using that phrase, girly men. Again, even not that long ago, but certainly a different way of talking about gender and some of these issues at that time. So as we start to wrap up, I'm curious if you feel like there is a Schwarzeneggerian legacy within the modern GOP, either policy-wise or in terms of the type of retail politics that he took on.
I mean, not the modern GOP, the one of the last few years. But I mean, there is something to be said about the difference between state-level GOP actors, particularly governors, not so much in the state houses, but in the governor's role, where that is the one space left for any kind of moderation within the Republican Party. And there are plenty of very conservative, plenty of very Trumpian state-level Republicans, but there really is still a space for a kind of moderate Republican that seems divorced from the overall direction of the party. But Schwarzenegger, I think, is an important player in that. And you see this in 2016 when he endorses John Kasich, who's actually pretty conservative, but also later says that he didn't vote for Donald Trump. I mean, there aren't that many Republicans who came out and said that. So I think that it's meaningful that there's still this kind of rump contingent of moderate Republicans.
Yeah, and as polarized as we are, you still get these blue state Republican governors. I think Vermont has a Republican governor. California has elected Republicans. Maryland.
Massachusetts has had them.
Right,
exactly. Somebody like Scott Brown.
Yeah, so I mean, that's one slot where it seems like there's still a little bit of this centrism. And yeah, again, I think it's governors just have to manage the state in front of them.
They have to actually execute, right?
Yes,
they have to govern.
Exactly.
And if they don't govern, they lose their jobs. And that's the thing that's so out of line with the ethos of the rest of the party.
And so I guess we're obliged to say, as we start to wrap up here, that this does weirdly come full circle to Donald Trump again, because Schwarzenegger does take over in 2017 as the host of the Celebrity Apprentice. And so these two figures do kind of weave in and out of each other.
And he gets razzed on Twitter for a pretty long time about the ratings of that show.
Yeah. Well, let's leave it there. And I just want to commend ourselves for not doing an impersonation, not really calling him the Governator very much. So, not saying I'll be back.
I got it all out of my system before I came on. I'll probably need to do a little bit more after we wrap up. But
fair enough.
Excellent restraint on our parts.
Yes. All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Follow us on social media. We're posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day, posting about moments big and small, way more than we can get to on the podcast. So follow our social feeds at This Day Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Reach out to us if you have any questions or comments about the show, thisdaypod@gmail.com. We'll be back with a new episode on Thursday. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Shall we rebuild our state together? Or shall we fight amongst ourselves, create even deeper division, and fail the people of California? Well, let me tell you something. The answer is clear. For the people to win, politics as usual must lose.
Radiotopia.